A baby marked for death, hidden in a basket of reeds. A prince who traded his crown for a shepherd's staff. A burning bush that didn't turn to ash. This is the story of a God who never forgets his people, and the man who dared to answer his call. From the banks of the Nile to the wilderness of Sinai, every plague, every miracle, every step was leading to one moment when chains would break, waters would part, and a nation would walk free. But this isn't just history, it's your story too. Because the same God who delivered Israel is calling you out of darkness into his glorious light. Hit play and witness the real Exodus.
The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt. Its waters flowed like liquid gold under the scorching sun, feeding crops, quenching thirst, carrying barges of limestone for monuments to immortality. Pharaohs had risen and fallen for centuries along its banks, but now a new king arose over Egypt, a king who knew not Joseph. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. Exodus 1:8. Imagine the halls of Memphis, palaces gleaming with lapis lazuli and gold. A young pharaoh, throne freshly seized, surveying maps of his empire. His advisors whisper, pointing at the eastern delta. "Look there, Majesty, Goshen, the Hebrews, they swarm like locusts now." Census scrolls unfurl, numbers climbing, 70 souls once, now hundreds of thousands. A people without statues to their gods, without loyalty to the double crown. Fear is a poison. It starts small. A tremor in the night, a rumor at the barracks. Pharaoh's dreams twist, visions of these foreigners lifting spears, joining invaders from the east. "Look," his war captains warn, "they outnumber native-born men 3-1 in the delta. If war comes, they could turn against us." The truth? The Hebrews prayed to an unseen God. They buried their dead facing a homeland they'd never seen. Their strangeness became suspicion. Their blessings became a threat. "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and, if war breaks out, they join our enemies." Exodus 1:9-10. Deal shrewdly. Such gentle words for such a dark design. First, the noose of policy. Taskmasters descended on Goshen. Smiling officials unrolled papyrus decrees. "A great honor! Your people shall build treasure cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, Ramses. Your strength will glorify Egypt." Bricks, millions upon millions of bricks. Mud mixed with straw, baked under a pitiless sun. The Hebrews cheered at first, proud to serve. But quotas grew, impossible weights. Whips cracked over bent backs. "Faster! Pharaoh demands more!" And then the straw was taken away. "Find your own straw, but your tally of bricks it shall not lessen." Desperation. Men scouring fields for stubble. Women weeping as fathers collapsed. Children smearing mud into molds with bare hands. Every sunrise, the groan of burdens renewed. Every sunset, the whimper of broken bodies. This was the shrewd dealing. Crush them with labor. Break their spirit. Make their birth rate plummet beneath the lash. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. They made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of field work. Bitter. Oh yes, the bitterness of dust in the throat, of blistered hands gripping ropes that cut, of looking up at monuments to gods who hated you. Pyramids scraped the sky, tombs for kings who called themselves divine. Hebrew sweat cemented each block. Hebrew blood stained the foundations. And Pharaoh, he walked in gardens of lotus blossoms, cooled by fans of ostrich plumes. Fear had birthed cruelty. Cruelty demanded more fear. The Hebrews were not vanishing. They were growing harder, stronger, defiant in their whispers. Even under the whip, they live, they thrive. Their women birth children between shifts. Their old men still pray to that desert god. Pharaoh's fist clenched. If slavery wouldn't break them, sharper tools were needed. The Nile had given life. Soon, it would be commanded to deliver death. The whips cracked like thunder over Goshen, day after day, night after night. The sun burned white-hot in a cloudless sky, bleaching the bones of the land. Hebrew backs bent under the weight of mud bricks, each one stamped with Pharaoh's scarab seal. Men staggered under loads meant for oxen. Women scraped the fields for straw, their fingers bleeding into the dry earth. Children dragged water skins larger than their small bodies. The air hung thick with dust and despair. This was Pharaoh's design: crush them, break them, make their numbers dwindle beneath the heel of Egypt. But life persisted, stubborn, defiant. In the darkest hours, Hebrew mothers pressed swollen hands to their bellies and felt the kick of hope. New life stirred in their wombs, and Pharaoh's spies noticed. Whispers slithered into the palace. Majesty, the slave women birthed like animals. Even without straw, even under the lash, their tents swell with children. Their old men still sing of Canaan. Their God gives them strength we cannot break. Rage coiled in Pharaoh's chest. His plan had failed. Slavery had not culled them. It had hardened them, forged them, made them multiply like reeds along the Nile. Fear curdled into something darker, more desperate. If labor could not erase them, then death itself must become the taskmaster. Pharaoh summoned 2 women, not soldiers, not overseers, Shiphrah and Puah, Hebrew midwives, masters of life's first cry. They stood trembling before the golden throne, the scent of birth blood still clinging to their robes. Pharaoh's voice dripped venom. When you help the Hebrew women give birth, watch as they deliver. If it is a son, kill him. If a daughter, let her live. Silence swallowed the hall. The order hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Death at the delivery stool, murder disguised as midwifery. Shiphrah and Puah walked back to Goshen in the fading light. The Nile glowed crimson in the sunset. It looked like blood. They did not speak. Words were too heavy, but their hearts beat the same truth. They feared God more than Pharaoh, the God who heard the cries of slaves, the God who knit life together in secret. That night they gathered the midwives under a moonless sky. We will not spill innocent blood. We will not become Pharaoh's knives. A pact was made, silent, sacred. When the cries of labor echoed through the tents, they ran not to kill, but to save. Hands gentle, prayers fervent. They whispered courage to mothers sweating in anguish. Push, sister, breathe, your God sees you. And when the slippery, squalling life emerged, they cleaned the tiny face, they counted fingers and toes, and placed the child, son or daughter, into the mother's exhausted arms. Your child is strong, your child is beautiful, your child lives. Days bled into weeks. Pharaoh's spies returned. The boys live, Majesty. The Hebrew women are too vigorous. They'd give birth before the midwives arrive. Pharaoh's face twisted. Fury burned in his eyes. He saw the lie. He saw their holy defiance, but he could not prove it. The midwives stood before him again, resolute, quiet. Shiphrah spoke softly. "The Hebrew women are not like delicate Egyptian ladies. They are hearty, like animals. By the time we reach them, the child is already born and cradled at the breast." Pharaoh's knuckles whitened on his scepter. He knew. They mocked him. They worshipped a god he could not see, and their God blessed them. Scripture would remember. God dealt well with the midwives. He gave them families of their own. Their tents filled with laughter. Their children played in the dust where death had been decreed. Pharaoh's fear curdled into madness. If the midwives would not kill, Egypt would. His next decree screamed across the Nile Delta. Every son born to the Hebrews, cast him into the river, drown him. Let the Nile, giver of Egypt's life, become a grave for Hebrew hope. Soldiers marched into Goshen. They kicked down flimsy tent doors. They tore screaming newborns from their mothers' breasts. They wrenched sons from fathers' trembling arms. The wails of the mothers rose like a storm, raw, guttural, a sound that scraped the sky. It clung to the reeds. It stained the water. It echoed in the palace where Pharaoh sat, deaf to everything but his own terror. The Nile flowed on, red with blood, heavy with tiny bones. But in the darkest tents, in the deepest night, mothers clutched their newborn sons and made desperate plans. They would hide them.
The Nile flowed dark under the moonless sky. Somewhere in its depths, tiny bones rested among the reeds. Pharaoh's soldiers had been thorough. Their sandals left deep prints in the riverbank mud as they marched from house to house, their arms heavy with squirming bundles. The water swallowed each offering without protest. But in the shadows between the slave huts, defiance took root. Shiphrah pressed her back against the rough clay wall of a birthing chamber. The air smelled of sweat and blood and crushed herbs. A young mother groaned on the mat before her, her fingers clawing at the dirt floor. The contractions came faster now, too fast. There would be no time to call for help, no time for soldiers to interfere. Shiphrah's hands moved with practiced certainty, catching the slippery body as it entered the world. A boy, perfect, whole. His first breath filled his lungs, and Shiphrah clapped a hand over his mouth before the cry could escape. The mother's eyes locked onto hers, wide with terror and hope. "You must not make a sound," Shiphrah whispered to the squirming child. "Your life depends on silence." Outside, sandals scraped against stone. Torchlight flickered under the door. The mother's breath hitched. Shiphrah moved quickly, tucking the newborn against the woman's chest and covering them both with a rough woolen blanket. She grabbed a clay jar of goat's milk and spilled some onto the floor, the sour scent masking the metallic tang of birth. When the door burst open, she was kneeling over a stillborn kid, her hands slick with afterbirth. "Another dead one," she said without looking up. "The goats fare no better than we do under Pharaoh's curses." The soldier's torch swept over the dim room, lingering on the mother's exhausted form. The blanket rose and fell with her ragged breathing. Nothing else moved. After a long moment, the soldier grunted and turned away. The door thudded shut. In the sudden quiet, the baby whimpered. Shiphrah's hands shook as she helped the mother unwrap him. His face was flushed from being pressed against warm skin, his mouth working silently. The mother's tears fell onto his forehead as she kissed him. "How long can we keep doing this?" the woman whispered.
She forensed her hands in a basin of water gone pink with blood. "As long as there is breath in our bodies," she said, "the God of our mothers sees what is done in secret. He will not forget." Across Goshen, in hidden rooms and buried pits, other midwives performed similar miracles. Puah taught mothers to nurse their babies without sound, pressing their faces into soft cloth to muffle their cries. Old Rachel, who had birthed 3 generations of slaves, brewed bitter teas to slow a woman's milk until her son could be smuggled away. They moved like shadows, these women, their hands gentle and their wills iron. Pharaoh's decree crashed against them like waves against stone, and like stone they endured. The river took many, but not all. In the darkest hour before dawn, when even the jackals slept, Jochebed crept to the water's edge. The bundle in her arms barely stirred. 3 months of hiding had left him thin but alert, his dark eyes reflecting the stars overhead. She had woven the basket herself, coating it with tar until it was as strong as a warrior's shield. As she placed it among the reeds, her fingers lingered on his cheek. "May the God of Abraham go with you," she breathed. Then she let go. The current caught the basket gently, carrying it toward the place where Pharaoh's daughter bathed, toward salvation, toward destiny. And on the bank, his sister Miriam watched, her small hands clenched.
The reeds whispered secrets to the Nile as Jochebed knelt in the pre-dawn gloom. 3 months of hiding had stretched her nerves thin as worn papyrus. Every cry muffled against her breast, every footstep outside their mud brick hovel sent her heart racing. Now, with Pharaoh's soldiers prowling closer, she cradled her son's warm weight one last time. His dark eyes stared up, trusting, innocent. She had worked through the night, fingers cramping as she wove the tiny ark. Acacia stalks formed its bones, river reeds its flesh, pitch sealed its seams against the hungry water. Not a coffin, a covenant, a mother's defiance wrapped in bulrushes. Miriam, barely tall enough to peer over the riverbank, clutched her mother's skirt. Will the river god spare him? The question hung between them. Jochebed kissed her son's forehead, breathing in his milky scent. "We serve a greater God than Hapi's waters," she murmured. Then with a shuddering breath, she placed the basket among the dancing reeds. The Nile's current curled around the tiny vessel like a question. Somewhere downstream, Pharaoh's daughter would be coming to bathe. Somewhere upstream, Egyptian soldiers dragged screaming infants from their mother's arms. Between these 2 truths, a basket bobbed, and a sister held her breath.
The morning sun glinted off the Nile's slow-moving waters as Pharaoh's daughter, Bethiah, stepped onto her private dock. Handmaidens carried jars of scented oils, their laughter light against the river's quiet murmur. The princess waded into the shallows, her linen robe floating around her like a lily pad. She closed her eyes, letting the water wash away the palace's stifling air, the politics, her father's temper, the whispers about the Hebrew blood staining the reeds. Then she heard it, a sound so faint, so impossible, it cut through the morning stillness like a blade. A baby's cry. Bethiah froze. Her attendants exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew the decree. Everyone had heard the screams echoing from Goshen at night. But this sound was different. Small, alive, insistent. The princess turned toward the reeds, where the tall stalks shivered as if hiding a secret. "Go," she commanded a servant. The young woman hesitated, then waded forward, pushing through the green curtain. A gasp, Then she emerged, arms cradling a dripping basket. Inside, a baby blinked up at them, his dark curls damped with river water. His tiny fists waved in protest at being disturbed. The woven ark had held, barely. One corner sagged, where the current had tested its seams. Bethiah reached out, her fingers brushing the baby's cheek. He quieted instantly, studying her with eyes far too wise for an infant. A Hebrew child, a boy. By her father's law, he should be feeding the crocodiles. But the princess had spent years watching Pharaoh's cruelty harden like the gold masks on his statues. This child was no rebel, no threat, just a life, small and warm and trembling in her hands. One of her attendants hissed, "My lady, we must call the guards." No. Bethiah's voice broke no argument. She cradled the basket against her chest. "This one is mine now." A rustle in the reeds. The princess turned to see a girl, no older than 8, standing knee-deep in the water. Her bare feet were muddy, her dress patched and frayed. But her gaze burned with a fierceness that made the handmaiden step back. Miriam held her breath. She had followed the basket downstream, her small heart pounding as it veered toward the royal party. Now she stared at the princess, at her brother cradled in gilded arms, and made the bravest gamble of her life. "Shall I find a Hebrew nurse for the child?" Silence. The Nile itself seemed to pause. Bethiah studied the girl. The too casual tone, the white-knuckled grip on her skirt. A smile tugged at her lips. She was royalty. She knew theater when she saw it. "Yes," the princess said at last, her voice carrying the weight of a decree. "Bring me a nurse, and quickly." Miriam ran. She flew through the shallows, her feet kicking up sprays of water, past the docks, past the guards who barely glanced at another slave child, through the maze of huts where women paused their grinding stones to watch her streak by. She skidded to a stop outside her own home, where Jochebed stood in the doorway, her face ashen. "He lives," Miriam gasped, "and the princess, she wants you." Jochebed's knees nearly gave way. 3 days of pretending her arms weren't empty. 3 nights of listening for wails that never came. Now she clutched Miriam's shoulders, her voice a broken whisper. "You're certain?" Miriam nodded, tugging her mother toward the river. "Hurry, before she changes her mind." They ran together, Jochebed's sandals slapping against the dirt path, past the brickyards where men still groaned under the sun, past the silent midwives who caught sight of them and pressed hands to their mouths. The princess waited where they'd left her, the baby now wrapped in fine linen, his head nestled against her shoulder. Bethiah took one look at Jochebed's face, the hope and terror warring in her eyes, and understood everything. She held out the child. "Take him," she said softly. "Nurse him for me. I will pay you for your service." Jochebed's arms remembered their purpose. They curved around her son, pulling him close until she could feel his heartbeat against hers. He smelled of the river still, of lotus oil and royal perfume, but beneath it all, her own scent, her milk, the home he'd been stolen from. Bethiah watched them with something unreadable in her gaze. "Bring him to the palace when he is weaned. He will be raised as my son." The princess turned away then, her attendants swirling around her like minnows. Jochebed stood rooted to the riverbank, her tears falling into her baby's hair. Pharaoh had commanded the Nile to drown her people's future, but the river had given it back. And on its sun-dappled surface, the basket, empty now, floated toward the horizon.
The years passed like the slow turning of the Nile's floodwaters. In the shadowed corners of Goshen, Jochebed watched her son grow, first in her own arms, then behind palace walls. Every morning she woke, wondering if this would be the day Pharaoh's daughter tired of her Hebrew pet. Every evening, she whispered prayers over the empty space where his cradle had been. But the princess kept her word. Twice each week, Jochebed would make the long walk to the palace kitchens, her basket heavy with fresh bread and dates, excuses to glimpse the boy who called another woman mother. She'd watch from the courtyard as Moses, now 5, practiced writing hieroglyphs under a tutor's watchful eye. His laughter rang differently here, polished smooth as palace marble. Yet sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd trace his fingers over the scars on his wrist, tiny half-moons where Jochebed's teeth had marked him during those desperate months of hiding. One humid evening, as fireflies danced over the river, Bithiah summoned her. The princess stood at her balcony, Moses asleep in her lap. "He asks questions I cannot answer," she admitted, her voice barely louder than the rustling papyrus. "About why his skin darkens in the sun while mine burns. About the songs the slave women sing." Jochebed's pulse thundered in her ears. Bithiah turned, her golden bracelets clinking. "Tell me of his people." And so, with the moon as their witness, the slave woman and the princess made an unspoken pact. Jochebed spoke of Abraham's covenant under the stars, of Joseph's betrayal and redemption. She omitted nothing, not the slavery, not the infant bones in the river. Bithiah listened, her face unreadable, her fingers stroking Moses' curls. When the first light of dawn gilded the horizon, the princess rose. "Come tomorrow," she said. "Teach him your stories where no scribe can hear." For 3 more years, Jochebed became her son's secret tutor. In hidden garden alcoves, she taught him the names of his ancestors, Levi, Jacob, Isaac. She showed him how to count the days until Shabbat. And when his Egyptian tutors spoke of Pharaoh as a living god, Moses would catch his birth mother's eye, and she'd press a finger to her lips, our secret. The day he turned 8, Bithiah met her at the servants' gate. "They're sending him to the Royal Academy at Heliopolis," she said. Jochebed's knees buckled. The princess steadied her with a hand colder than the Nile in flood season. "He will return a man, an Egyptian." That night, Jochebed walked home alone. The reeds whispered where Miriam waited, now a gangly girl of 12. "Will he remember us?" she asked. Somewhere downstream, a child's laughter echoed across the water. Maybe Moses, maybe another's. Jochebed pulled her shawl tighter. "The river never forgets its own," she said. And high above them, the stars of Abraham's promise burned indifferent and bright. The halls of Pharaoh's palace echoed with the measured footsteps of scholars and the rustle of papyrus scrolls. Young Moses moved through these builded corridors with an ease that belied his true origins, his sandals whispering against polished limestone floors inlaid with turquoise. The royal tutors had been thorough in their work, erasing the slave's Hebrew from his tongue, replacing it with the crisp consonants of Egyptian aristocracy. Yet sometimes, in the deepest watches of the night, he would startle awake with half-remembered lullabies humming in his blood. Memphis unfolded before him like an illuminated manuscript. From the palace's highest terrace, he could trace the Nile's winding path through fields of emerald green, watch the sun catch gold leaf on temple obelisks, count the smoke rising from 1,000 brick kilns where his people groaned under the lash. The contrast never failed to steal his breath. Here, in the cool shade of colonnades, servants fanned him with palm fronds, while just beyond the city walls, Hebrew children collapsed carrying water for their dying mothers. His royal education was both privilege and weapon. The mathematics tutor made him calculate grain taxes exacted from Goshen. The swordmaster taught him to wield chopesh, the same curved blade that kept slave rebellions in check. During theology lessons in the temple of Ptah, priests extolled Pharaoh's divinity, while Moses' fingers traced hidden scars on his wrist, the faint marks of infant teeth where his birth mother had bitten him silent during soldier raids. Bithiah watched her adopted son with quiet pride and growing unease. She had given him everything, his name meaning born of the river god, his place at Pharaoh's right hand, even the golden ankh pendant that now rested against his chest. But when the court musicians played, his foot tapped to rhythms no Egyptian recognized. When he thought himself unobserved, his gaze lingered too long on the eastern delta, where the slave quarters' fires burned after dark. The crisis came during his 16th year, a royal procession to inspect construction at Ramses. Moses rode in a chariot beside Pharaoh, his linen headdress fluttering, the crowd's cheers washing over him. Then he saw them. Hebrew slaves, their backs striped with whip marks, their eyes hollow as they mixed mortar with bleeding hands. One old man collapsed mid-task. The overseer's lash rose. Without thinking, Moses vaulted from the moving chariot. The courtyard froze. The overseer's lash hung suspended. Pharaoh's eyebrows climbed his forehead. Moses stood trembling between the slave and the lash, his body acting before his mind could counsel royal decorum. For one heartbeat, two, the only sound was the old Hebrew's labored breathing at his feet. Then Pharaoh laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "My tender-hearted prince," he mocked, tossing a gold bracelet to the overseer. "Let the dog rest. His God won't save him from tomorrow's quota." That night, Moses lay awake staring at the painted stars on his ceiling. The old slave's whisper as he helped him up haunted him. "You have your mother's hands." Somewhere in the palace gardens, a nightingale sang. Somewhere beyond the walls, a Hebrew mother wept for a son she could never claim. And in the space between these two truths, a prince began to drown.
The chariot wheels threw up clouds of golden dust as Moses raced along the royal road to Heliopolis. At 17, he wore the striped Nemes headdress of Egyptian nobility, his arms bronzed from hours training with the army. The afternoon sun glinted off the golden falcon clasp at his shoulder, a gift from Pharaoh for besting 30 Nubian warriors in combat. Yet as he passed the boundary stones of Goshen, his grip tightened on the reins. A group of Hebrew slaves staggered under the weight of granite blocks, their backs striped with fresh lash marks. One old man collapsed, his ribs protruding like the hull of a wrecked ship. The Egyptian overseer raised his whip, and Moses saw the brand on the slave's shoulder, a Levite mark, his mother's people. Before conscious thought took hold, Moses found himself standing between the whip and its target, the overseer's face twisted in recognition. "Prince Moses! This dog was stealing water!" "Then let him drink," Moses heard himself say. His voice sounded strange, the Egyptian accent suddenly thick as Nile mud. The slaves' heads snapped up at his words, their hollow eyes bored into him, some with fear, others with a hatred so sharp it made his skin prickle. That night in the palace baths, Moses scrubbed at his hands until they bled, but couldn't wash away the old man's whisper as he helped him drink. "You have your mother's eyes, boy." The words clung like river reeds. His reflection in the bronze mirror seemed to shift. One moment the clean-shaven Egyptian prince, the next a wild-haired Hebrew with soot-streaked cheeks. Sleep brought no peace. Dreams of a woman singing through clenched teeth, her teeth marks on his infant wrist, a basket spinning in dark waters. He woke screaming in a language his servants didn't recognize. By his 20th year, Moses moved through palace life like a ghost. At state banquets, he tasted nothing of the roasted ibis and honeyed figs. During temple ceremonies, he stood mute while priests chanted praises to gods whose stone eyes watched him with disdain. Only in the royal archives did he find solace, tracing his stylus over crumbling tablets that spoke of a different God, a voice in flames, a promise whispered to desert wanderers. The breaking point came on the eve of his 25th birthday. Pharaoh hosted a feast to celebrate Moses' appointment as overseer of public works. Wine flowed as dancers twirled between lotus-shaped braziers. Then the king raised his cup. "To my grandson, more Egyptian than the Nile itself." Laughter rippled through the hall. Across the room, Bethiah's smile didn't reach her eyes. Moses' golden goblet shattered in his grip. He fled to the moonlit gardens where the scent of blue lilies choked him. There, among the imported cedars, he found his Hebrew nurse, now gray-haired, still sneaking into the palace with laundry deliveries. For the first time in 18 years, he spoke to her in the forbidden tongue. "Who am I?" Jochebed didn't flinch. "The river answered that question long ago, my son." She pressed a scrap of cloth into his hands, the very linen that had lined his basket. Then she vanished into the shadows, leaving Moses alone with the truth howling in his chest. The next morning he rode out before dawn, his chariot cutting through the mist rising off the Nile. He passed the slave quarter where women already bent over grinding stones, their children's hungry wails piercing the stillness. Further on, at the edge of a half-built temple, an Egyptian overseer beat a Hebrew slave senseless while two others held the man down. Something in Moses snapped. Later, the scribes would record it as an accident, a tragic collapse of unstable stonework. But as Moses dragged the Egyptian's body into the desert, his hands still warm with stolen life, he knew the truth. The prince was dead. Only the Hebrew remained. For 7 nights he wandered the wastelands beyond Memphis, stripping off his jewelry piece by piece. The golden falcon clasp sank into quicksand. His linen robes became tattered rags. When the vultures began circling, Moses finally understood what the desert was telling him. "You chose your people. Now, become one of them."
The desert sun beat down like a hammer on bronze as Moses staggered through the wasteland east of Memphis. 5 days without water had cracked his lips and blurred his vision. The blood had long since flaked off his hands, but the Egyptian overseer's dying gasp still echoed in his skull. He'd buried the body beneath a cairn of stones, yet the weight of it pressed heavier with each step. At twilight on the 6th day, hallucinations began. The sandstone cliffs morphed into Pharaoh's judges, pointing accusing fingers. Vultures circling overhead became the Eye of Horus, watching his every move. When he collapsed near a dry wadi, his fingers clawed at the sand like a drowning man seeking air. Murderer. The accusation came not from the wilderness, but from his own cracked lips. He'd killed without thinking, one moment watching the overseer's whip descend, the next standing over a corpse with a blood-slicked stone in his hand. The Hebrew slaves had scattered like frightened goats, their terrified eyes branding him more deeply than any hot iron. On the seventh day, when death's shadow stretched longest, Moses heard the sound of bleating goats. Forcing his swollen eyes open, he saw 7 figures approaching through the heat shimmer. Young women in Midianite robes, their water jars balanced gracefully on their heads. With the last of his strength, he croaked a warning as they neared a well where rough-looking herdsmen were already drawing water. The men shoved the women aside with coarse laughter. "Wait your turn, daughters of Riel." Something stirred in Moses' ravaged body, that same fire that had made him strike the Egyptian. He rose like a specter from the sand, his tattered linen flapping about his skeletal frame. The herdsmen froze at the sight of this gaunt apparition with Egyptian tattoos and wild, sun-maddened eyes. "The well is wide enough for all," Moses rasped, placing himself between the men and women. His voice carried the unconscious command of palace training. To his own surprise, the herdsmen backed away, muttering about desert demons. The eldest sister studied him with frank curiosity as she drew water. "You speak like a prince, but look like a dead man." She pressed a full water skin to his chest. "Drink, stranger, then tell us why Pharaoh's justice hunts you." The water tasted of clay and mercy. As Moses gulped it down, he noticed his reflection in the well's surface, a face no longer Egyptian nor Hebrew, but something raw and new. The daughter of Riel tilted her head. "You have the look of a man who has burned his past." Moses let the empty water skin fall. "There is no going back." She nodded toward the western horizon, where storm clouds gathered over Egypt. "Then come with us, killer of men and defender of women. The desert makes its own laws." As they led him toward the tents of Midian, Moses glanced back once at the fading glint of Memphis's gold-tipped obelisks. Somewhere beyond those walls, his Egyptian self lay buried beneath official lies. Somewhere in the slave quarters, his Hebrew kin whispered of a failed deliverer. The wind erased his footprints as completely as history would soon erase Prince Moses.
The first moon rise in Midian nearly broke Moses. Rule's daughters led him to their father's tent at twilight, where the old priest king sat cross-legged before a fire, reading the stars. The scent of roasting lamb and cumin filled the air, so different from the lotus perfumes of Memphis. When the eldest daughter explained how this skeletal Egyptian had defended them, Rule's eyes gleamed like polished onyx in the firelight. "You stink of death and regret," Rule said matter-of-factly, tossing Moses a pomegranate. "Eat first. Then we'll decide if you're worth the water it will take to wash you." As Moses devoured the fruit, juice running down his wrists like thin blood, Rule studied his tattoos, the royal cartouche on his shoulder, the eye of Horus peeking through tattered linen. "Pharaoh's mark won't protect you here, boy. Only my hospitality does. And that," he nodded toward the horizon where lightning flickered over distant Egypt, "depends on whether you can tend sheep without getting lost in your own head." The daughters laughed. Moses flushed. He who had commanded chariot squadrons, now being offered a shepherd's staff. Yet when Zipporah,
The second eldest handed him the rough-hewn rod. Their fingers brushed, and something unexpected passed between them. Not pity, recognition. That first night under the open sky, Moses lay awake, listening to desert jackals howl. The wool blankets scratched his skin, coarse compared to Egyptian linen. Every muscle ached from the journey, yet his mind raced. He kept seeing the overseer's face in the moment the stones struck, kept hearing the Hebrew slave's warning shout that had given him away. A shadow fell across him. Zipporah stood, holding a clay lamp, its flame painting her strong features in gold and shadow. "You whimper like a puppy in your sleep," she said, kneeling beside him. Before he could protest, she pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. The desert fever takes many this way. Her hands worked with practical grace, wringing out the cloth in a basin of water scented with hyssop. Moses tried to sit up, but she pushed him back down with surprising strength. "Lie still, Egyptian. My father didn't drag you from death's jaws just to watch you wander back. I'm not." Moses began, then stopped. What was he now? Not Egyptian, not Hebrew, just a murderer with nowhere to belong. Zipporah studied him as if reading his thoughts. In Midian, we judge a man by his actions, not his bloodline. She nodded toward the flock sleeping beyond the firelight. "Tomorrow you'll learn their names. The stubborn one with the black spot, we call her Pharaoh." A startled laugh escaped Moses' cracked lips. The sound seemed to surprise them both. As Zipporah moved away, her final words floated back. "The desert doesn't care who you were, only who you're becoming." Dawn came painted in colors no Egyptian artist could replicate. Russet cliffs bleeding into pink sky. The air so clear it hurt to breathe. Rule tossed Moses a shepherd's crook and pointed southwest, where the land rose in rocky folds. "The spring pasture lies beyond the Red Canyon. Lose one sheep, and you'll wish you'd faced Pharaoh's justice instead of my temper." The flock moved like living water across the stones, 70-odd woolly bodies flowing around boulders in perfect unity. Moses soon discovered their hierarchy: the lead ewe with her regal bearing, the troublemaker who kept straying, the timid ones that needed constant reassurance. By midday, his Egyptian sandals had disintegrated, and he walked barefoot like the daughters, his soles toughening with every step. At the watering hole, as the sheep drank, Moses caught himself in reflection. A gaunt stranger stared back, beard coming in patchy, hair matted with dust, eyes older than his 25 years. He touched the fading tattoo on his shoulder. Somewhere beneath the grime, the cartouche still proclaimed him son of Ra. A stone plunked into the water, shattering the image. Zipporah stood on the far bank, her sling still swinging. "Stop admiring yourself and help gather strays," she called, already turning her mare toward the cliffs. As Moses scrambled after her, something loosened in his chest. The desert stretched endless in every direction, its indifference strangely comforting. Here, under this pitiless sun, his past crimes mattered less than keeping the flock intact. The sheep didn't care about bloodlines or buried bodies. They only responded to steady hands and watchful eyes. That evening, when Rule asked what he'd learned, Moses stared into the fire and said nothing. The old priest smiled. "Good. Men who talk too much make poor shepherds." Zipporah handed Moses a bowl of lentil stew. Their fingers brushed again, and this time neither pulled away.
The seasons turned like the pages of some ancient scroll. Moses learned to read the desert's subtle language. The way morning dew clung to spider webs meant clear skies ahead, while ants building high walls spoke of coming storms. His hands, once soft from palace life, now bore the rugged map of his new existence. Rope burns from pulling lambs from crevices, scars from fending off jackals, nails perpetually caked with earth. 40 days' journey from Egypt's nearest outpost, Moses found himself alone with the flock at the mountain of God. Horeb's jagged peaks cut into the twilight like broken teeth. The sheep moved sluggishly in the evening cool, their wool catching on thorn bushes as they searched for one last mouthful of scrub grass before bedding down. A gust of wind sent a tumbleweed skittering across Moses' path. He paused, staff planted firmly in the cracked earth. The desert had taught him to listen to such signs. This was no ordinary breeze. It carried the scent of lightning from a clear sky, the electric tang of something beyond nature. Then he saw it. A single acacia bush blazed against the gathering dark, not burning to ashes like normal fire, but shimmering with impossible light, each flame-kissed leaf remaining whole and green. The sheep bleated nervously, pressing their warm bodies against Moses as he stood transfixed. "Remove your sandals." The voice came not from the bush, but from the air itself, from the rocks beneath his feet, from the very marrow of his bones. It resonated with the same power that had once made Pharaoh's courtiers prostrate themselves. Yet this was no mortal ruler speaking. Moses' fingers fumbled with the leather ties. The moment his bare feet touched holy ground, memories flooded him. His mother's whispered prayers, the feel of papyrus as he'd secretly copied Hebrew scriptures in the royal archives, the dying overseer's blood hot on his hands. Every moment of his fractured life suddenly woven together with terrifying clarity. "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt." The words struck Moses like physical blows. This was no distant deity demanding tribute, but a God who heard slave songs beneath brick pits, who counted each infant tear shed in the reeds. The same God whose name his mother had choked back during palace visits, whose promises had kept his ancestors hoping for 400 years of bondage. "Now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh." Moses' knees gave way. The staff he'd carried for decades clattered to the ground, its wood suddenly alive, twisting into a hissing cobra. He scrambled back, heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. All his desert years hadn't erased the Egyptian terror of serpents, symbols of divine wrath. A laugh echoed through the flames, warm and terrible. "Take it by the tail." Every instinct screamed against touching the thrashing creature. Yet when Moses grasped the viper, it stiffened in his hand, becoming once more a shepherd's staff. The message burned clear. The same God who made serpents could unmake them. The power to terrify Pharaoh already lay coiled in Moses' palm. "But who am I to go?" The question burst from him, raw as the wound he had carried since childhood. "I failed them before. I'm just a—" "The man I chose." The fire brightened, revealing charred stones where Moses had stood moments before. "When you struck that Egyptian, you acted alone. This time, I strike through you." Dawn's first light found Moses still prostrate before the smoking bush, his cheeks streaked with tears, his soul scoured clean. The sheep grazed undisturbed, their wool glinting like silver in the new sun. Only the sandals left neatly at the burning bush's base marked this as anything but an ordinary morning. Zipporah would notice the change immediately when he returned. The new weight in his gaze, the way his hand kept straying to the staff, now crackling with invisible power. She'd demand answers he couldn't yet give. For how could he explain that after 40 years of hiding, the God of his mothers had finally named him? That the desert's long silence was over. The journey back from Horeb took 3 days, though Moses moved as one in a dream. The staff in his hand no longer felt like mere wood. It hummed with latent power, its surface still faintly warm to the touch. When he closed his eyes, he saw the bush's unearthly flames dancing behind his eyelids. Zipporah met him at the edge of camp, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She took one look at his ash-streaked tunic and the wild light in his eyes before seizing his wrist. "You've seen something," she accused, her fingers tightening like a falcon's talons. Moses opened his mouth, but the words that came out weren't his own. "I must return to Egypt." The color drained from Zipporah's face. She dragged him behind their tent, away from curious ears. "Have you gone mad? Pharaoh's decree still stands. They'll execute you before you reach the Nile Delta." When Moses held out his staff, letting it transform into a serpent and back again, Zipporah stumbled backward, knocking over a water jar. The clay shattered like the fragile normalcy they'd built over decades. "El Shaddai has spoken," Moses whispered. The ancient name hung between them, the God of Abraham, whose stories Zipporah's people still told around campfires. She pressed both hands to her mouth, staring at the staff as if it might bite her. That night, as their sons Gershom and Eleazar slept, Zipporah cocked their meager belongings with furious precision. "If you think I'm letting you walk into that viper's nest alone, I can't ask you to. You didn't ask," she whirled on him, a skinning knife flashing in the firelight. "I made a vow when I married you, Moses, not to some Egyptian prince, but to a runaway with blood on his hands." The argument might have continued had their youngest not awakened crying. As Moses lifted Eleazar, his boy's small fingers brushed the uncircumcised flesh, a glaring omission in their half-Hebrew household. A cold realization settled in his gut. He couldn't lead God's people while his own sons bore the mark of compromise. At midnight, with the camp asleep, Moses took the flint knife from Zipporah's belt. The blade gleamed in the moonlight as he carried Eleazar outside. He never heard Zipporah's approach. One moment he knelt alone, the next her hand closed over his on the knife's hilt. Her breath came fast against his neck. "You fool! You'd make the cut without knowing the prayers." Moses froze. For 40 years he'd lived as an outsider, too Hebrew for Egypt, too Egyptian for Midian. Now this fierce woman who'd chosen him despite his past stood ready to bridge the final gap. Zipporah took the knife. What followed was quick and brutal, her practiced hands moving with the same efficiency she used when birthing lambs. As Eleazar's screams pierced the night, she smeared the blood across Moses' feet, an ancient sign of ownership. "Now you are truly a bridegroom of blood to me," she panted, the words both accusation and covenant. When the deed was done, she gathered both sons and marched toward Reuel's tent without looking back. Moses stood alone in the moonlight, the child's blood drying on his skin, understanding at last the price of obedience. Come dawn, the household awoke to find Zipporah already saddling the donkeys. Reuel took one look at the bandaged child and the resolved set of her daughter's shoulders before pulling Moses aside. "You'll take the southern trade route," he muttered, pressing a water skin into Moses' hands. "Avoid the Egyptian patrols near the copper mines." The old priest hesitated, then added something that made Moses' throat tighten. "My people have a saying, the same wind that extinguishes a candle fans a wildfire. Perhaps your God intends the latter." As the sun crested the cliffs, Moses' family began the long journey west, toward slavery, toward Pharaoh, toward a destiny written in stars and blood and burning bushes. Zipporah rode stiff-backed, her knife still stained, her gaze fixed on the horizon where Egypt waited. And Moses, for the first time in his life, walked fully into who he was meant to be. The desert air shimmered like molten glass as Moses crested the ridge overlooking the Egyptian delta. 40 years melted away as the familiar stench of Nile mud and human sweat washed over him, a far cry from Midian's clean winds. Below, the endless checkerboard of slave quarters stretched into the haze, their mud-brick walls leaning like exhausted laborers. Somewhere in that maze of suffering, Aaron would be waiting. Moses' sandals dislodged a pebble that clattered down the slope. The sound echoed like the memory of another rock, the one that had crushed an Egyptian overseer's skull. His fingers tightened around the staff that once was a serpent, its wood still humming with the afterglow of Horeb's fire. "When you take it by the tail, it will become a staff again." Exodus 4:4. The reassurance rang hollow now. What madness was this? A fugitive murderer returning to challenge the mightiest empire on earth. His tongue, still heavy with decades of disuse, felt like a lump of clay in his mouth. "Who gave human beings their mouths? Is it not I, the Lord?" The rebuke came not as a voice, but as a sudden pressure behind his ribs. Moses exhaled sharply, watching the afternoon sun gild the distant pylons of Ramses. How many Hebrew backs had broken building those monuments? How many infant bones fertilized their foundations? A lizard darted across his path, its scales catching the light like miniature armor. Moses smiled grimly. He'd once worn gold-plated corsets while reviewing troops. Now his only protection was the worn wool of a shepherd's cloak and the impossible promise of a bush that refused to burn. The confrontation came at twilight near the limestone quarries. A gang of Hebrew slaves shuffled past, their ankles chained, their shoulders raw from whiplashes. Moses froze when he recognized the brand on one man's chest, the same Levite mark his mother had borne. Before he could speak, a gnarled hand seized his elbow. "Brother." The voice startled Moses more than the touch. Aaron stood before him, white-haired and sunken-cheeked, yet with eyes that mirrored his own. How had he recognized him after 40 years? The answer came in Aaron's next words. "Your mother described you perfectly, said I'd know you by the way you hold your shoulders, like a man carrying invisible bricks." Moses' throat tightened. Jochebed had been dead 20 years, yet her words still bridged time. Aaron pressed something into his palm, a tiny blue thread from the corner of a prayer shawl, the last relic of their parents. "The elders are waiting," Aaron murmured, steering Moses toward a gap between two grain silos. "Though I warn you, hope is scarce as water here." The meeting took place in a tomb hollowed beneath a storehouse. 30-odd men crowded the chamber, their faces gaunt in the flickering oil lamps. When Moses raised his staff, showing how it became a serpent, a collective gasp echoed off the walls. "The Lord has surely seen our misery and has come to help us." Exodus 4:31. Yet when Moses spoke of confronting Pharaoh, nervous murmurs rippled through the group. An old brickmaker, missing 3 fingers from an accident, spat into the dust. "You think signs and wonders will move that crocodile's heart? He'll add our heads to his wall before he frees a single worker." Moses met each doubting stare in turn. He'd anticipated this. What he hadn't expected was the visceral stench of their fear, sour as curdled milk. These men had been broken so thoroughly, even the promise of deliverance terrified them. It was Aaron who bridged the gap. Stepping forward, he repeated every word God had spoken at Horeb, his voice gaining strength with each syllable. By the time he described the promised land, flowing with milk and honey, tears glistened on several faces. Aaron will be your prophet. You will be as God to him. Exodus 4:16. The hierarchy became clear in that moment. Moses would carry the divine fire, but Aaron would translate it for mortal hearts, a partnership forged in blood and shared memory. As dawn tinged the eastern sky, the brothers emerged from hiding. The morning breeze carried the distant bellow of a sacred Apis bull, the sound that had once signaled another day of royal pomp. Now it was a battle cry. Moses touched the blue thread in his palm, then looked toward the palace gleaming in the distance. Somewhere behind those gilded walls, Pharaoh would be waking to reports of unrest. Let him rage. Let him summon every sorcerer and soldier. The bush still burned. The palace gates loomed before them like the jaws of some great beast, their bronze hinges groaning in the morning heat. Moses felt the weight of decades pressing down as he crossed the threshold, where he'd once ridden in a gilded litter. The courtyard hadn't changed. Same lotus-shaped pools where royal children floated toy boats. Same towering statues of hawk-headed gods with jeweled eyes. Only now he noticed the Hebrew handprints fossilized in the mud bricks. Aaron's sandals scuffed nervously beside him. "Remember," Moses whispered, "it's not our words, but his." The throne room stank of myrrh and sweat. Pharaoh lounged on the dais, his kohl-rimmed eyes narrowing as he recognized the old prince beneath the desert-worn robes. "So, the murderer returns," he drawled, flicking a gold-tipped fingernail against his wine cup. "Did the sand finally scour away your wits?" Moses planted his staff on the inlaid floor. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Silence. Then laughter exploded from the courtiers. Pharaoh's belly shook beneath his pleated linen. Which god? The river's crocodiles? The dung beetles rolling their balls through the fields? He leaned forward, suddenly venomous. "I am Egypt's god. My word drowns all others." Aaron stepped forward, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. We must journey 3 days into the wilderness to offer sacrifices, lest he strike us with plagues or sword." Exodus 5:1-3. Pharaoh's smile turned jagged. "You dare steal Egypt's workforce for your superstitions?" He snapped his fingers. A scribe scurried forward with a papyrus scroll. "From this hour, no more straw will be given for bricks. Let them gather stubble themselves, but the daily quota stands." Exodus 5:7-8. The cruelty was brilliant. Moses saw the calculation in Pharaoh's smirk. Make the slaves blame their would-be liberators. As they were escorted out, Hebrew foremen already glared at them with betrayed eyes. That night, the brothers crouched in an abandoned kiln while wails rose from Goshen. A young brickmaker hurled a broken shard at Moses' feet. "You've made us stink before Pharaoh. Now he'll kill us all." Exodus 5:21. Aaron lit a rushlight, revealing Moses' face streaked with silent tears. "Was this your plan, brother? To get our people whipped harder?" Moses stared at the flickering flame. He'd forgotten the suffocating weight of Egyptian politics, how Pharaoh turned everything into a game of measured cruelties. The staff at his side felt suddenly inert, just dead wood again. "Now you shall see what I will do." Exodus 6:1. The voice came not from the burning bush this time, but from the kiln's very walls. The bricks themselves seemed to whisper it. Moses pressed his palms against the hot clay and felt the vibration of something vast moving beneath the earth. Aaron gasped. The rushlight's flame had frozen mid-flicker, bending unnaturally toward the Nile. Somewhere in the darkness, frogs began croaking out of season. Moses stood, knocking over a pile of discarded straw. It wasn't defeat Pharaoh had invited with his defiance. It was war.
The moon hung like a sliver of broken pottery over the slave quarters as Moses and Aaron picked their way through the maze of mud brick huts. The air smelled of crushed coriander and despair. Tonight's bread ration had been halved as punishment for the brothers' audacity. Inside a cramped dwelling where the walls still bore the tiny handprints of children taken by the Nile, 7 elders waited with hollow eyes. Moses raised his staff, but the men recoiled as if it were a serpent again. "No more signs," croaked the oldest, his back permanently bent from decades of hauling stone. "Pharaoh's scribes already tally our dead for tomorrow's burial detail." Aaron caught Moses' wrist before he could respond. In the flickering oil light, the brothers' faces mirrored each other's exhaustion, one weathered by desert sun, the other by the unrelenting whip. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet." Exodus chapter 7, verse 1. The division of roles became clear that night. While Moses carried the terrible weight of divine authority, Aaron would translate it for trembling hearts. The elder who'd spoken pressed a gnarled finger to Moses' chest. "You speak like a man who's forgotten our chains, but Aaron, his shoulders bear the same stripes as ours." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hut. Moses studied his brother in the dim light, truly seeing him for the first time since their reunion. Aaron's arms were cross-hatched with scars from Egyptian lashes. His left pinky finger ended at the first knuckle, a brickmaker's accident. These weren't theoretical sufferings, they were the lived reality of every Hebrew groaning under Pharaoh's yoke. Aaron seemed to sense Moses' realization. He reached into his threadbare robe and produced a small clay tablet, the kind scribes used for practice. On its surface, he'd carefully incised the Hebrew alphabet. "I've been teaching the children in secret, so they might read the promises of our God," he said softly. The admission struck Moses like a physical blow. While he'd wandered Midian's wilderness, Aaron had kept their people's hope alive, one whispered letter at a time. "You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go." Exodus chapter 7, verse 2. At dawn, when the brothers stood before Pharaoh's court again, their dynamic had shifted. Moses stood rigid as a cedar, his staff planted like a standard of war. But it was Aaron who stepped forward to address the smirking monarch. "Thus says the Lord God of the Hebrews." Aaron's voice carried across the throne room, roughened by decades of brick dust, yet unshakable. "By this you shall know that I am the Lord." Exodus chapter 7, verse 17. He cast down Moses' staff, and the polished wood became a writhing serpent before the entire court. A collective gasp rose as the cobra reared up, its hood flaring toward Pharaoh's gilded sandals. The king merely snapped his fingers. 2 priests of Thoth hurried forward with their own serpent rods, chanting as they threw them down, the sticks twisted into asps. But Aaron's cobra struck with terrifying speed, swallowing the lesser snakes whole.
Exodus chapter 7, verses 10 to 12. A beat of stunned silence. Then Pharaoh laughed, the sound echoing hollowly off the painted walls. A pretty trick, but Egypt's gods demand stronger proof than snake swallowing. Moses felt the moment crystallize, the exact pivot point between request and judgment. He met Aaron's eyes and saw the same understanding there. The time for warnings had passed. As they turned to leave, Aaron's hand found Moses' elbow, steadying him. The brothers walked from the palace not as supplicants, but as heralds of the storm about to break over Egypt. Behind them, Pharaoh's mocking voice followed. "Let me see this desert god of yours trouble the Nile's waters." The challenge hung in the air like the scent before lightning strikes.
The acacia trees whispered secrets as Zipporah packed their meager belongings by firelight. Moses watched his wife's hands move with methodical precision, rolling goat hair blankets, securing clay jars of precious myrrh oil, tucking the flint knife that had sealed their covenant into her belt. Every motion spoke of finality. They would not return to these high desert plains where they'd raised their sons, where the stars hung so close you could pluck them like ripe figs. Gershom, now nearly 20, with his father's restless eyes, crouched beside the embers. "Why must we go?" His voice cracked like the drying earth. "Egypt took 40 years from you. Must it take our future too?" Moses stirred the coals with his staff, sending up a shower of sparks. The wood still carried the scent of Horeb's holy ground. "When I was your age," he said slowly, "I thought justice came at the point of a sword." He touched the old scar on his ribs where an Egyptian spear had grazed him during military drills. "But the desert taught me, true deliverance requires a different kind of strength." Across the fire, Eleazar, barely 15 and all knees and elbows, clutched the wooden ram figurine Reuel had carved him at weaning. "Will they try to kill us?" Zipporah answered before Moses could. "Undoubtedly." She tied the last bundle with a sharp jerk of the rope. "But your father's God parts seas and sets bushes aflame. I imagine he can handle Egyptian spearmen." The bitterness in her tone surprised Moses. For 40 days since the burning bush, they had avoided this reckoning. Now, with dawn creeping over the cliffs, all unspoken things rose like desert ghosts between them. "You don't believe," Moses realized aloud. Zipporah's hand stilled. "I believe you saw something on that mountain, but must the boys pay for your vision?" A gust of wind rattled the tent pegs. Moses remembered another night long ago, Zipporah pressing their newborn to her chest while Egyptian soldiers searched nearby huts. The same protective fury burned in her eyes now. "Go and assemble the elders of Israel, and say to them, I have watched over you and seen what has been done to you in Egypt." The divine command echoed in Moses' skull, but the human cost lay sprawled before him. Gershom's clenched jaw, Eleazar's trembling lip, Zipporah's white-knuckled grip on her knife. This was the true test, not facing Pharaoh, but leading his own family into the viper's nest. Reuel arrived at first light with a train of donkeys laden with supplies. The old priest-king smelled of cedar oil and sacrifice, his ceremonial robes brushing the dew-laden grass. "Take the southern trade route," he instructed, pressing a bronze dagger into Moses' hand. "The copper mines are less patrolled this season." Moses clasped his father-in-law's weathered hands. "Walk with us as far as the wadi." But Reuel shook his head, his gaze drifting toward the mountain where Moses had met God. "My place is here, preparing the altars for your return." He cupped Eleazar's cheek. "When you cross back through these lands, boy, bring me an Egyptian souvenir, perhaps one of Pharaoh's armbands." The attempted humor fell flat. Even the donkeys seemed to sense the gravity, braying nervously as Zipporah loaded them. The sun had barely cleared the cliffs when their little caravan began snaking westward. Moses walked ahead with his staff, scanning the rocks for vipers and Egyptian scouts. Behind him, the rhythmic plod of donkey hooves marked their progress, each step carrying them further from safety. At midday, when they paused at a brackish spring, Zipporah pointed silently to the horizon. Dust spirals rose in the distance, a military patrol moving along the trade road. Moses herded the family into a narrow canyon, pressing them against the warm stone as hoofbeats thundered past. Eleazar's breath came in ragged gasps. "They'll kill us before we even reach the Nile." Gershom gripped his brother's shoulder. "Then we'll take a few Egyptians with us." Zipporah hushed them with a sharp gesture. The patrol passed without incident, but the close call left them all shaken. That night, as they camped in a hollow between dunes, Moses awoke to find his wife standing watch with her knife drawn. "You should sleep." Her silhouette didn't move. "Someone must keep you alive long enough for your God to work." The words hung between them, as heavy as the unspoken question, "What if we're wrong?" Moses studied his sleeping sons, Gershom's face already taking on the hardened lines of a warrior, Eleazar still soft with youth. He'd led them into the wilderness with nothing but a voice in his head and a stick that turned into snakes. A rustle in the dark made them both tense. But it was only a desert fox, its eyes gleaming as it sniffed at their supplies before vanishing into the night. Zipporah's shoulder slumped. "Your people have a saying," Moses said softly. "The same wind that extinguishes a candle fans a wildfire." She turned her face away, but not before he saw the tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "Pray this fire doesn't consume our sons." 3 days later, they crested the final ridge overlooking the Nile Valley. The great river coiled through the land like a lazy serpent, its brown waters glinting under the harsh sun. Beyond its banks, the slave quarters of Ramesses sprawled like an open wound, thousands of mud-brick hovels pressed against the gleaming white monuments of Pharaoh. Gershom sucked in a breath. So many. Moses felt the weight of each life pressing upon him. Somewhere in that sea of suffering, Aaron would be waiting. Somewhere behind those palace walls, Pharaoh stirred like a crocodile sensing disturbance in the water. Zipporah adjusted the straps on a donkey's pack. "Well, Moses of Egypt and Midian, how does your God plan to feed all these mouths when we free them?" Moses lifted his staff, watching the sunlight play along its withered grain. "One plague at a time." And with that, they began the descent toward destiny. The stench of mud and sweat clung thick to the air as Moses and Aaron slipped through the slave quarters under cover of darkness. The narrow alleys between mud-brick huts twisted like a serpent's path, every shadow hiding potential informants. Moses' sandals stuck to the ground, not from Nile silt, but from the sticky residue of spilled blood where Egyptian overseers had made examples of rebellious workers. A hand shot out from a darkened doorway, yanking Moses inside. His staff was halfway to striking when he recognized the face, Eleazar, son of Dathan, now a grizzled man with a scar where an Egyptian whip had taken his left eye. "You're late," Eleazar hissed. "The elders have waited 3 nights, risking their necks." Aaron placed a calming hand on Eleazar's shoulder. "We had to avoid the new patrols. Pharaoh's doubled the guard since—" His voice trailed off as they entered the hidden chamber. 30 faces turned toward them, illuminated by a single oil lamp. Moses recognized some. Her, now white-bearded and leaning on a walking stick. Miriam, her once lustrous hair now gray, but her eyes still sharp as flint. Others were new, younger men bearing the hollow cheeks and sunken eyes of lifelong bondage. Miriam was the first to speak. "Little brother returns with grand promises." Her voice carried the same teasing lilt Moses remembered from childhood, but edged with something harder now. 40 years ago you killed one Egyptian. Now you come to challenge them all? Moses unstrapped the staff from his back. The moment it touched the earthen floor, the wood writhed into a hissing cobra. Several elders scrambled backward, knocking over clay jars. The serpent reared up, its hood flaring toward her, who stood frozen, his walking stick raised in trembling defense. With a swift motion, Moses seized the cobra by its tail. The creature stiffened, becoming lifeless wood once more. A collective gasp filled the room. Then they will believe the Lord has appeared to you. Silence stretched like the endless labor shifts. Finally, a young brickmaker named Eliel spoke. So you can do tricks? Can you make straw appear for our bricks? Can you turn back the whips? His hands were raw, the nails blackened from days of scavenging stubble. Aaron stepped forward, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a network of scars. You think we don't know you're suffering? These marks, he traced a particularly vicious welt across his forearm, came last week when I demanded fair rations for the children. The room erupted. Pharaoh will slaughter us all. My son already works double shifts because of your last visit. Better slavery than mass graves. Moses let the storm rage, watching the play of shadows on their faces. He'd anticipated doubt, but this raw terror was something deeper, the trauma of generations conditioned to believe resistance meant annihilation. Miriam silenced them with a sharp whistle. Enough, she turned to Moses. Show us again. This time, when the staff transformed, Moses let the serpent slither freely among them. The elders watched transfixed as it coiled around Aaron's arm without striking, its tongue flicking curiously at his scars. Take this staff in your hand, you will use it to perform the signs. When the serpent became a staff once more, Hur reached out to touch it. His gnarled fingers traced the grain. This is acacia wood. From the holy mountain? Moses nodded. A murmur spread through the room. Acacia was the same wood used to build the portable sanctuaries of their ancestors. The symbolism wasn't lost on them. Eliel wasn't convinced. Even if your God is real, why now? Why after 400 years? The question Moses had wrestled with in Midian. He lifted the staff, letting the lamplight play along its length, because a bush burned without being consumed, because a river will turn to blood, because the same God who numbered the stars has counted every lash on your backs. His voice dropped to a whisper, and he says, enough. For the first time, something kindled in the elders' eyes, not quite faith, but the fragile possibility of it. Hur straightened with difficulty. What would you have us do? Aaron instructed, gather the people at dawn. Tell them to prepare, not for rebellion, but for journey. Miriam's eyes narrowed. Journey to where? Moses met her gaze. To that mountain. He pointed east, toward the distant peaks glowing under the moon, where I met the God of Abraham face to face. As the elders dispersed like shadows, Moses caught snippets of their whispers. Madness, or if the stories are true, or better to die free. Aaron exhaled sharply. They'll need more than snake tricks to face Pharaoh. Moses turned the staff in his hands, remembering the inferno that hadn't consumed the bush. Oh, they'll get more, much more. Outside, the first wails of the night watch began, Egyptian guards making their rounds. Somewhere in the darkness, a child coughed weakly. The plague season was coming, and Moses' God never arrived empty-handed. The pre-dawn air hung heavy with the scent of baking bread as Moses and Aaron approached the palace gates for their final confrontation. The massive cedar doors, inlaid with lapis lazuli scarabs, stood slightly ajar, an unspoken taunt from a king who believed himself untouchable. Moses' sandals scuffed against the blood-stained stones where petitioners often knelt too slowly for Pharaoh's taste. Aaron gripped his brother's arm. "Remember, it's not our words, but his." Inside the throne room, the morning light filtered through alabaster windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished basalt floor. Pharaoh Amenhotep II lounged on his lion-footed throne, his freshly oiled chest gleaming under a collar of golden falcons. Behind him, the vizier Horemheb smirked while scribbling on a papyrus scroll, recording this meeting for royal archives, no doubt. "Ah, the desert prophet returns." Pharaoh's voice dripped honeyed venom. He popped a date into his mouth, chewing slowly before continuing. "Come to beg for more brick straw? Or perhaps to demonstrate another of your peasant tricks?" Moses' sand grew warm in his hand. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "Thus says Yahweh, God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me." Exodus 8, verse 1. The courtiers tittered. A priest of Amun muttered about blasphemy. Pharaoh merely raised an eyebrow. "Your God still hasn't learned, has he? Egypt does not bow to slave-drunk shepherds." He gestured to a servant, who hurried forward with a golden basin for him to wash his hands. "I'll make this simple. Perform your sign, then my magicians will duplicate it, and we'll all have a good laugh before you return to your hovels." Aaron cast down the staff. The moment it struck stone, the polished basalt seemed to liquefy beneath it. The wooden rod transformed into a massive cobra, not the slender desert variety, but the great hooded serpent of the Nile Delta, its scales gleaming like oil in sunlight. Gasps echoed through the hall as the reptile reared up, its head nearly level with Pharaoh's throne. For a heartbeat, the king's mask slipped. Then he snapped his fingers. "Janus, Jambres!" Two elderly priests shuffled forward, their leopard skin cloaks brushing the floor. With theatrical flourishes, they threw down their serpent rods. The sticks twisted into asps, only for Moses' cobra to strike with terrifying speed, swallowing both snakes whole before the court's astonished eyes. The throne room erupted. Women screamed. Guards lowered their spears. Pharaoh rose, his face purpling beneath the shent crown. "Enough!" He turned to his magicians. "Again!" But the old priests were backing away, their hands raised defensively. "This is beyond our art, son of Ra," Jans whispered. A terrible silence fell. Moses locked eyes with the man who had once called him grandson. "By this you shall know that I am Yahweh." He reached down, and the cobra became a staff once more in his hand. "Tomorrow, at this same hour, the Nile will turn to blood. Every stream, every canal, even the water in your precious alabaster jars." Exodus 7, verses 17 to 19. Pharaoh's knuckles whitened on his scepter. "Give out!" As they retreated through the grand corridors, Aaron's breath came in short gasps. He didn't relent, not even slightly. Moses watched the first rays of sunrise paint the eastern horizon crimson. He won't, not until the firstborn cry out in the night. Exodus 11, verses 4 and 5. The brothers walked in silence past the towering statues of Amenhotep's ancestors, each stone face frozen in eternal arrogance. At the gates, a familiar figure waited. Miriam stood with her arms crossed, her white hair glowing in the dawn light. "Well," she demanded. Moses turned back toward the palace, where slaves were already scrubbing the floors in preparation for the day's audiences. Somewhere in those walls, Pharaoh would be consulting his priests, sacrificing to Hapi, the Nile god, desperately trying to assert control. Tell the people to gather their belongings and to mark their doorposts. Miriam's eyes widened. Then it begins. As they walked toward the slave quarters, the first screams erupted from the riverbanks. Moses didn't need to look back to know what was happening. The Nile's life-giving waters thickening to viscous red, fish flopping onto the banks in their death throes, Egyptians scrambling with golden pitchers only to find every vessel filled with blood. Exodus 7, verses 20 and 21. The first plague had come. And Pharaoh's heart, hardened like clay in a kiln, would only grow more stubborn with each divine stroke.
From a burning bush to an empty tomb, the cry of Exodus echoes through eternity. A baby spared from death, a prince turned prophet, a river turned to blood, and finally, a midnight escape through parted seas. This was never just Moses' story. It's the pattern of our God. He sees oppression, he sends deliverance. He makes a way where there is none. The same God who heard Hebrew slaves hears you now. The same power that crushed Pharaoh broke sin's chains at Calvary. Christ is our Passover lamb. His blood marks us, his spirit leads us, and his promise stands. I will bring you out into freedom. Today, the call still sounds, let my people go. Not from Pharaoh's Egypt, but from fear's grip, sin's slavery, and death's shadow. Walk forward, child of God. Your Red Sea awaits. Your wilderness will bloom, and your deliverer, the greater Moses, goes before you.